All right, in this video, we are going to talk about inheritance in Java and specifically what to do with constructors. Okay, so first off, a little review, right, in case you have forgotten. And a constructor, right, that is called when you create an object from a class, okay? And if you do not write a constructor for a class, then Java automatically supplies one for you, okay? And so even though it doesn't appear in your class, if you don't put a constructor in there, Java puts one in there for you. And that constructor is called the default constructor. All right. So let's take a look at actually, I don't think I have one here because these examples I went ahead and put one in there, right? So, but I could easily just take this one out, comment it out, right? And so I have no constructor in there. So this was a constructor, right? Remember, you can tell that it's a constructor because a constructor has the same name as the name of the class, okay? And no return type, okay? If you don't put a constructor in there, Java automatically puts one in there for you, all right? And the default constructor it has no parameters, okay? So no parameters, right? Remember, the parameter list is the stuff inside the parentheses. So I'm going to put this back in, put the constructor back in here. All right, and so this constructor has no parameters. If I pull up another example, here. Here is an example of a class called a parent class, and this class has a constructor here. Right? In fact, it has two constructors, one here and one here. Again, you can tell because they have exactly the same name as the name of the class. Right? And this constructor has one parameter, this constructor has two parameters. Okay? So, the automatically supplied constructor called the default constructor, and that's when you don't put one in there at all. Java puts one in there for you. It has no parameters. Okay. The minute you write your own constructor, whether it has parameters or not, Java takes away that default constructor. Okay. So as soon as you put one in there, the default constructor is gone. Right. So for instance, in this class, a parent class, I put my own constructor in there, right? That default constructor is no longer an option. It's gone. Java says, okay, well, you're going to put your own in there, then I'm taking the default one back. Fine. Okay. So that's the situation that we are looking at. All right. So we have the default constructor. That's the one that Java automatically puts in there. It has no parameters. When you put your own constructor, Java takes that one back. That constructor that you put in your class, right, might have no parameters. It might have one, it might have two, it might have three, and so on and so forth. Okay, so there's lots of different scenarios. All right. So now the situation when it comes to inheritance and constructors is this: constructors are not inherited. Okay. And when you create an object from a child class, right, you are going to call at least two constructors. The first one is the constructor for the parent class, and the second is the constructor for the child class. All right. So if you think about it in this way, right, if you have a parent and a child, which one came first, right? The parent has to exist first before the child does, unless you're in some weird situation like the movie The Terminator, right? Or the show Dark, where the dad is from the past or something like that. But that's not what we're talking about, or the future, right? So anyway, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about not time travel, but the normal situation, right? The constructor, the parent object class, all that stuff has to get set up first, okay? So the parent class constructor must execute first. All right, that means that you have to know how to call a parent class constructor from the child class. All right, and there's basically two situations. All right, and first is the easy case. The easy case, and these two cases depend on the parent class constructor. All right, if the parent class constructor has no parameters, right, there's nothing that you really have to do. Okay, so think about what a constructor is. A constructor is a method that gets called when an object is created. Okay, and those parameters, right, that are in the constructor, what that is basically the information that is required to create the object. So if there's no parameters, there's no information that you need to supply in order to do the creation. So if the parent class constructor has no parameters, the first method, right, for calling the parent class constructor is don't do anything, because Java is automatically going to call the parent constructor without parameters. Okay, so you don't have to do anything. You can explicitly tell it to call the parent class constructor by putting super in there with an open and closed parentheses. All right, in the previous video when we were talking about method overriding, we said that you can use the super reference. That's always going to refer to the parent. So, but in that situation, it was super and then with no parentheses and then dot and then whatever method that you wanted to call. All right, this is completely different. This is super with an open and closed parentheses. That is going to refer to the constructor in the parent class. Okay, so this, you can put that in there and call that. All right, let's take a look at an example. All right, so in this example, I have a parent class. The parent class has this constructor. It has no parameters in it. All right, and then I have two child classes. This child class has a constructor, and this is basically using method 1, which is don't do anything because Java is going to do it for you. Okay, and then I created another child class. Right, you can see its parent class is a parent class, and here I'm using that second method that I showed you about. I'm using the super reference with open and closed parentheses, and that will tell Java to go and call the parent class. So you don't really have to do that. Most of the time, I just do it like this in method 1. All right, so here's what's going to happen if I look at this class with the main method. It's going to set up a child class. It's going to set up another child class. And you're really not going to see any, much if you run it, all right, because it prints out some things inside here. What you really need to do is to run this through Canvas and JGraphs. So it's Control-Shift-R to run it. And now we can step through and watch exactly how this gets executed. Okay, so we're going to hit the curvy arrow all through. That is going to step into each of these constructors, and we'll see it bounce around. All right, so here we go. We are creating an A child class object called kid1. So here we are calling the constructor for A child class. So I'm going to hit the curved arrow. You're going to see that it's going to bounce on over to A child class. Okay. It goes into the constructor and it's going to get everything set up. When I hit this again, you're going to see it automatically bounces to the constructor of the parent class. So you can see it did everything like it was supposed to. All right. So the parent comes into existence, right? We get that message in the parent constructor. That gets set up. Once the parent gets set up, it goes back, and now that the parent exists, now the child can come into being. Okay. So here we get this, it bounces back to the child class and prints out that line in the child class constructor. The child class constructor is done, so it bounces back to where the constructor was called from, back here in this demo class. All right, and then boom, my child class object is set up. All right, there's nothing in it, so it just kind of looks blank. All right, same thing is going to happen here when we create this other child class. Here we are calling the constructor in another child class to set up this another child class object called kid2. All right, so when I hit this curved arrow, you're going to see it's going to bounce over to the constructor for another child class. In that constructor, I have the explicit call to super. This is going to go now and bounce to the parent class constructor, a parent class. So when I do that, it's going to bounce on over to a parent class. Now a parent class is going to get set up. All right, so everything gets set up in the parent. The constructor is done. So boom, the parent class object is created, right? Or all set up. It comes into existence. So now the child can get set up and come into existence, right? And so we get that message. So now the child class constructor is completely set up. And so therefore, boom, we have our child object. Okay. So that is case one, right? When the parent class has either the default constructor or a constructor with no parameters, right? Then it's really not too difficult of a situation. You don't have to do anything, right, to get this to work. All right, so let's take a look at the second situation. If you have a parent class who's only has constructors that have parameters, you have to use the super reference. And not only do you have to use the super reference, right? You have to look at the parent class constructor and see what parameters it has. The child class has to supply those parameters to the parent, which is a weird kind of situation, but that's how it has to go. All right. So you have to put this super call as the first line of the constructor. For every parameter in the parent class, you have to supply some kind of value. Okay. All right. So this is the more complicated situation. Let's take a look at it. All right. Let me close these out. And go to the parameter parent constructor example. All right. So here is the parent class in this situation. The parent class has two constructors. It has this constructor, right? And this constructor has one parameter. So what that means is if the parent is going to come into existence using this constructor, a number, an int value has to be supplied. The second constructor has two parameters, right? Both ints. So that means if you're going to use this constructor to create one of the parent class objects, you have to give two numbers, okay? Two ints, all right? Okay, so now let's run this and see how it goes. So what I do in this demo class is to create two child class objects, okay? And then I print them out. So again, it's a lot better if we trace through and take a look at that. But before we trace through, let's look at each child class, all right? So here in this child class, a child class, we have this parameter, right? Or this constructor with no parameters in it, all right? So what that means is that the very first line of the child class must be a call to the parent class, all right? One of these two constructors has to be called, okay? Either this one or this one, all right? So I just decided to call the first one, all right? And I just decided to put a 3 in here. There's no good reason why I did that, okay? I just didn't want to try to make these examples as simple as possible. So I just picked a number in 3. That's really not what you would do. But don't worry about that too much. In the example where I'll work through a complete example in the next video, and you'll see how it's normally done, okay? The main point here that I'm trying to drive home here is that because the parent class has these two constructors, one with one parameter and the other with two parameters, when you create a child class, which a child class is a child class of a parent class, then you must call one of those constructors explicitly, and it has to be the first line in your constructor. Okay, let's take a look at the other child class called another child class. All right, you can see it is a child class of a parent class. It has this one constructor. This constructor has no parameters, right? But because the parent class only has constructors with parameters, I either have to put one number or two numbers, right, in the call to super. That must be the first line in the child class constructor. Okay. In this case, again, I just chose 2 to use the one with 2. Just give you a different example. Again, I just made these numbers up, 5 and 9. They have no significance whatsoever. Like I said, in the example, I'll show you how that works. Okay. But this is absolutely required. Okay. If I comment this out and try to run that program that I ran before, you're going to get a error message, and you will see here it says no suitable constructor found for a parent class. So basically here I was acting as if the parent class had a constructor with no parameters, right? Because I didn't have that super. And when Java went over here and looked and said, okay, well, that has 1 parameter, so that can't be right. That has 2 parameters, that can't be right. And there's no other constructors. So Java's like, well, what do you want me to do? I have no idea what to do. You told me to call a constructor with no parameters, and there's not one here. So I don't know. And it quit. Okay? All right, so this is absolutely required. All right. Let's run through this with Canvas, and then we'll get to an example. So Control-Shift-R, and I'm going to step through this. Actually, did not want to do that so quickly, so let me start over. All right, Control-Shift-R. All right, so here I am in the demo class, the one with the main method, and so I am creating an child class object, so I call the constructor right here. So you're going to see it's going to bounce on over to a child class and into the constructor, and the very first thing is this call right here, super3, right? So super with the parentheses means go to the parent class and call this constructor and give it this one piece of information. So you're going to see that Java is then going to bounce on over to the parent class, right? Because the parent class has to get set up first, right? And Java, because I gave it one number, automatically knew to go to this constructor with one thing in here. So the constructor, parent constructor gets set up. It sets up this field, a number, prints out that message, which you normally wouldn't do. Just did that so you can kind of follow the action in this example. All right, so the parent is going to get all set up, and then it's going to bounce back and finish setting up the child. All right, so it just prints out that message. All right, it bounces back to the main method, and boom, there is your kid1 object, right? And or your child class object. You can see it's completely set up with the number 3 that I passed to it. Okay. Next up is the call, the second class, another child class. We're going to call its constructor. You're going to see it's going to bounce on over to the child class constructor, another child class. It bounces on over there, right? And then here, again, the very first line has to be this super line in this situation, right? And here we are supplying 2 int values. So this is telling Java, hey, go to the parent class, which is a parent class. Search around for a constructor that has 2 parameters that are type int, and put 5 in the first parameter and 9 in the second parameter. All right, and you're going to see that's exactly what it is going to do. It's going to bounce on over to a parent class. You can see it automatically went to this one with 2 constructors, and you can see it put 5 in this parameter, and it put a 9 in this parameter right here. All right, and then it's going to get the field set up. It's going to set it to 5 minus 9. So that is going to be -4. It's going to print that message again. You normally wouldn't do that. It's just to kind of see how the flow of the program is going. and then you would bounce back. And now that the parent object is set up, then the child class is going to get completely set up, right? The parent has to come into existence before the child. And so boom, there is my kid2 object, right? And you can see that it has a -4 as the constructor, as the value for the field, okay? And then it's going to print out the values in there. All right. You can see each of the child classes have two different toString methods. All right, and that is the end of it. So again, slightly more complicated when you start putting constructors in. The easy case is, and it all kind of depends on the parent class, right? The parent has to get set up before the child. So if the parent class has parameters or constructors with no parameters, you basically don't have to do anything. You can, but you don't have to. But if the parent class only has constructors with parameters, you've got to take care of those parents first, right, and get them set up. So you must have that super call in the child class constructor. All right. All right. In the next video, we are going to take a look at an example and how to put all this together.